A classified telex arrived at ASIO's Washington liaison office on the morning of November 10, 1975. It had been routed through intelligence channels rather than diplomatic ones, deliberately bypassing the Australian government entirely. The man who sent it was Theodore Shackley, head of the CIA's East Asia Division, a man whose personal history read like a catalogue of America's most controversial Cold War interventions: Miami, Laos, Saigon, Chile, and now, apparently, Canberra. The telex was read to Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam within hours of its transmission. What it said, officially and in the formal language of the intelligence world, was that the elected leader of a sovereign allied nation was a security risk in his own country. One day later, that Prime Minister was gone, removed from office by the Governor-General of Australia in a constitutional crisis that still produces heated argument 5 decades on, but the telex was just the final act. The story began years earlier, in Saigon, in the classified corridors of an intelligence relationship that most Australians didn't even know their country was involved in, because for the first 20 years of its existence, Australia's overseas spy agency didn't officially exist at all. Wait, what? A CIA division chief sent a classified démarche through intelligence channels, bypassing normal diplomatic protocols, to pressure an allied government, not an adversary, not a communist regime, but Australia, one of America's closest allies. And that pressure contributed to the removal of a democratically elected prime minister? And that same CIA East Asia chief had been the station chief in Vietnam during the years when Australian intelligence operatives were operating in one of the most classified zones of the war? Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think, because what the CIA produced about Australian intelligence officers operating inside the classified intelligence architecture of Southeast Asia, the assessments they wrote, the pressure they applied, the lines they crossed between Allied cooperation and targeted removal of inconvenient people, none of that would make sense unless you understood what Australia's intelligence apparatus actually was, what it was doing in Vietnam, and why the CIA simultaneously needed it and feared it. By the end of this, you will understand why a CIA officer in Saigon reached for language that compared Australian government officials to North Vietnamese collaborators. You will understand why the CIA's most dangerous operator in East Asia eventually put in writing that the leader of a Five Eyes ally was a security risk. And you will understand why the most classified zone of the Vietnam intelligence war wasn't a jungle firebase or a North Vietnamese communications network. It was the relationship itself, the partnership between Allied intelligence services that was never supposed to be examined too closely by anyone who wasn't inside it. Stay with me. To understand why the CIA felt it could target its own allies' intelligence operations, you have to understand what kind of intelligence relationship Australia and the United States actually had in Vietnam, and how far that relationship had drifted from what anyone in Canberra had authorized. The Australian Secret Intelligence Service was not a household name. It was not even a publicly known entity. On the 13th of May, 1952, Prime Minister Robert Menzies established ISIS by executive order, and the existence of ISIS remained secret even within the Australian government until 1972. Think about that. For 20 years, Australia ran a foreign intelligence service that most of its own cabinet ministers had no idea existed. It had no legislative basis. It had no parliamentary oversight. It operated under a ministerial charter that described its role in the language of 1954 as obtaining and distributing secret intelligence and conducting special operations as required. Special operations. The charter's vagueness was deliberate. ASIS's charter described the agency's role as to obtain and distribute secret intelligence and to plan for and conduct special operations as may be required, and ASIS was expressly required to operate outside Australian territory. Outside Australian territory meant, in practical terms, wherever the United States and Britain decided Australia's intelligence resources were useful, which in the 1960s meant Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, ASIS worked closely with Allied agencies, including the CIA, to gather information on activities in Southeast Asia, and was instrumental in providing intelligence that helped monitor communist movements in the region. That sentence, clinical and bloodless in any official summary, contains worlds of operational complexity it doesn't reveal. Working closely with the CIA in Southeast Asia in the 1960s was not a coffee and briefings arrangement. The CIA in Vietnam was conducting paramilitary campaigns, running agent networks into North Vietnam, organizing Montagnard tribal forces in the Central Highlands, managing the Phoenix program's systematic targeting of Viet Cong political infrastructure, and operating a signals intelligence architecture of enormous complexity that stretched from Saigon through Bangkok and across to the joint facility at Pine Gap, deep in the Australian outback near Alice Springs. When Australia worked closely with all of this, Australia became part of all of this, and some of what it became part of was officially sanctioned in Canberra, and some of it absolutely was not. ACES played a crucial role during the Vietnam War and the Indonesian confrontation in the 1960s, providing valuable intelligence support to Australian military forces. But the support ran in both directions and not always along authorized channels. In the 1960s, Australia provided black teams to be run by the CIA. The phrase black teams is worth sitting with for a moment. In intelligence terminology, black operations are those with no acknowledged official sponsorship, no fingerprints, no paper trail back to a government. When an Australian national provided intelligence or operational support in a black capacity, they were functioning not as an official of the Australian government, but as an asset of the CIA, accountable not to Canberra but to Langley. The elected government of Australia, which had authorized ACES to collect intelligence and conduct special operations, may not have authorized this specific category of work. In the operational reality of 1960s Saigon, the distinction may have seemed administrative. In the constitutional and diplomatic reality of what came later, it was explosive. The CIA's Saigon station was the largest overseas CIA station in the world during the peak years of American involvement. It employed hundreds of officers, ran operations into every province of South Vietnam, maintained liaison with South Vietnamese intelligence services, coordinated with American military intelligence, ran covert action programs, and served as the intelligence nerve center for a war that was consuming the resources of the world's largest military power. Into this enormous, complex machinery, Australian intelligence officers were embedded. They were there officially as liaison officers, exchanging intelligence product through the Five Eyes arrangement that had governed signals intelligence sharing since the late 1940s. The origins of the Five Eyes alliance can be traced to informal, secret meetings during World War II between British and American codebreakers that took place before the U.S. formally entered the war, and the alliance was formalized in the post-war era by the UK-USA agreement in 1946. Australia was a full partner in this arrangement, and Australian operators worked in Vietnam as part of that partnership. During the Vietnam War, Australian and New Zealand operators in the Asia-Pacific region worked directly to support the United States, while GCHQ operators stationed in the then British colony of Hong Kong were tasked with monitoring North Vietnamese air defense networks. But official liaison and embedded operations were only part of the picture. For a time, ASIO operated in Vietnam in advising the South Vietnam government on conducting surveillance and counter-espionage operations. ASIS would have assisted the South Vietnamese in their spying operations, and DSD would have been monitoring North Vietnamese radio communications and especially Soviet merchant shipping, which was transporting arms and SAM missiles for use against America's aerial bombardment. The overlap between advising, assisting, and operating was real and not always clearly defined. When an Australian intelligence officer advised South Vietnamese counterparts on surveillance methodology and sat in on their briefings and reviewed their intelligence product, they were operating in one of the most classified zones in the war. Not because of battlefield danger, though that was real enough in a city regularly targeted by Viet Cong attacks and riddled with North Vietnamese agents, but classified in the deeper sense. The zone where the real intelligence war was fought was the zone of human sources, agent networks, liaison relationships, and covert operations, and that zone had no clean national boundaries. The CIA understood this perfectly. They had designed the system that way, an intelligence alliance in which the smaller partners contributed local knowledge, regional relationships, and specialized capabilities in exchange for the intelligence product and operational resources of the larger partner, was exactly what the Five Eyes framework provided. Australia's contribution to the Vietnam intelligence architecture was genuine and valuable. Australian officers understood Southeast Asian culture and politics in ways that many American officers did not. Australian military and intelligence personnel had operated in Malaya during the emergency and in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, and they had developed counterinsurgency and counterintelligence skills that the CIA found genuinely useful. The knowledge ran deep, the relationships ran deep, and the access that came with those relationships ran deep into the classified architecture of the American intelligence war in Vietnam, which meant that when the political situation in Australia changed, the CIA had a problem, not an abstract problem, a very specific operational problem. Australian intelligence officers who had been embedded in the most classified zones of American operations in Vietnam knew things. They had seen things. They had access to things. And the new Australian government, elected in December 1972 under Gough Whitlam, was asking questions that the CIA did not want answered. The rupture between Australian and American intelligence over Vietnam had been building for years before it finally exploded. Its roots lay in the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the relationship. Australia was simultaneously a genuine intelligence partner, contributing meaningfully to American operations, and a sovereign nation whose elected government had the right to know what its intelligence services were doing. Those two things were incompatible with the way the CIA had structured the operational relationship in Vietnam and across Southeast Asia. Frank Snepp was chief analyst of North Vietnamese strategy for the Central Intelligence Agency in Saigon during the Vietnam War. He was not a peripheral figure. He was at the center of the analytical machine that processed everything the CIA collected in Vietnam. He understood what the intelligence relationship with Australia looked like from the inside of the American apparatus, and his assessment, when the Whitlam government took power and began publicly criticizing American bombing campaigns and withdrawing Australian forces, was delivered in language stripped of diplomatic courtesy. Frank Snepp, a CIA officer stationed in Saigon at the time, said, "We were told that the Australians might as well be regarded as North Vietnamese collaborators." That sentence was not casual. In the intelligence world, where language is chosen carefully and every word carries operational weight, characterizing an ally as equivalent to the enemy is not a conversational slip. It is a classification. And once an intelligence service classifies an ally as a potential adversary, the operational implications are significant and immediate. The phrase North Vietnamese collaborators would have circulated in CIA assessments and internal communications as a framework for understanding the Australians. Not the Australian Army. Australian forces in Phuoc Toi Province were still fighting effectively, maintaining operational independence from American command, but contributing genuine results to the Allied effort. Not Australian intelligence officers who were continuing to share product through established liaison channels. The target of the collaborators' characterization was the political leadership, the elected government in Canberra, that was asking inconvenient questions about what Australia's intelligence services were actually doing in Vietnam and elsewhere. But intelligence services don't always maintain clean distinctions between political leadership and operational personnel. When the CIA decided that the Whitlam government was a problem, the Australian intelligence officers operating in the classified zones of the Vietnam intelligence architecture became part of that problem. To understand exactly how they became part of it, you need to understand what was happening in the classified zones themselves during the years when ACIS was embedded in the American intelligence apparatus in Southeast Asia. The CIA's Saigon station was running operations that extended far beyond Vietnam. An ACIS station was established in Chile out of the Australian Embassy in July 1971 at the request of the CIA and authorized by then Liberal Party Foreign Minister William McMahon. This is a critical detail. An ACIS station in Chile, established at CIA request, operating out of the Australian Embassy in Santiago, working against the elected government of Salvador Allende. Australia's intelligence service was not acting as an independent national intelligence agency with Australian interests in mind. It was acting as a proxy service for the CIA, conducting CIA operations under Australian cover in a South American country, with which Australia had no direct security conflict. The Australian government of the time authorized this, but the authorization came from a conservative government deeply integrated into the American intelligence partnership. When the government changed, everything changed. New Labour Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was informed of the operation in February 1973 and signed a document ordering the closure of the operation several weeks later. On July 1, 1973, the ACIS station in Chile reported that it had shut down and destroyed all records. But the closure of Chile was only the beginning of the rupture. Because Whitlam now understood something that had been deliberately kept from Labour governments for decades, that Australia's intelligence services, nominally arms of the Australian government, had been operating in a relationship with the CIA so intimate that distinguishing Australian national intelligence interests from CIA operational objectives had become nearly impossible. The intelligence apparatus Whitlam had inherited was not running Australian operations with CIA support. It was running CIA operations under Australian cover. Whitlam told Parliament that when my government took office, Australian intelligence personnel were working as proxies of the CIA in destabilizing the government of Chile. Proxies, that word, which Whitlam used in Parliament, named the operational reality that the CIA had carefully constructed over 2 decades of partnership. Australian intelligence officers weren't allies, they were instruments. And once Whitlam understood this, he began asking what else his intelligence services were doing as CIA instruments, including in Vietnam, where Australian officers were embedded in the most sensitive joint operations of the war. The CIA's response to Australian political scrutiny was not to open its books or reassure its ally that the relationship was conducted on honest terms. The CIA's response was to escalate. In 1974, Whitlam ordered the head of ASIO, Peter Barber, to sever all ties with the CIA. Barber ignored Whitlam's order, and contact between Australian and U.S. security agencies was driven underground. Let that land for a moment. The elected Prime Minister of Australia, the head of the government that ASIO nominally served, ordered his intelligence service to cease a particular relationship, and the intelligence service ignored the order. This was not a bureaucratic misunderstanding. The head of ASIO, Peter Barber, made a deliberate institutional choice to maintain CIA liaison over the explicit instructions of his Prime Minister. The intelligence services had developed a loyalty to their foreign partner that superseded their loyalty to their own elected government. And in Vietnam, where Australian officers were embedded in joint operations, this meant those officers were part of an intelligence architecture that their own government's head could not control. The CIA understood the leverage this gave them. Australian intelligence officers in Vietnam were sitting inside operations they had no authority to publicly disclose, working in relationships the existence of which the Australian government had only recently learned, running product through channels their Prime Minister could not access. They were, from a purely operational standpoint, ideal tools for a CIA that needed to maintain information dominance over an inconvenient ally. The Saigon station knew what Australian officers had been involved in. It knew which operations they had participated in, which agents they had met, which intelligence they had seen. And if those Australian officers' government began asking questions that threatened American operations, the CIA had the ability to contextualize those officers in whatever framework served its interests. Theodore Shackley understood this leverage better than anyone. He made his name in covert action, first as head of the CIA's Miami-based operation against Castro, then as CIA station chief in Laos and Vietnam. Shackley in Vietnam was not running a liaison operation. He was running a war, the secret war in Laos, the Phoenix program's systematic targeting of Viet Cong infrastructure, the agent networks and paramilitary campaigns that operated in the classified darkness beneath the official American military presence. He knew the Australian intelligence officers embedded in his apparatus. He knew what they had access to. And when he became head of the CIA's East Asia Division, he retained that knowledge and that operational perspective. The Australians inside his intelligence architecture were assets until they became liabilities, and the political changes in Canberra were converting them from the first category to the second. The classified zone that matters most in this story was not a specific geographic location, though the Saigon station and its tentacles through South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were certainly part of it. The classified zone was the operational relationship itself, the network of joint operations, shared sources, embedded personnel, and reciprocal intelligence that had been built up between Australian and American intelligence services over decades. Australian officers who had operated in this zone knew things that were simultaneously intelligence gold and political dynamite. They knew which South Vietnamese officials were CIA assets. They knew which operations in Laos had Australian participation. They knew the full extent of Australia's operational integration into the American intelligence war in ways that were never disclosed to Australian parliaments or publics. And when the Whitlam government began peeling back the layers of what Australia's intelligence services had been doing, those officers became the potential source of exactly the kind of disclosures the CIA most feared. Whitlam's threat to not renew the lease on the Pine Gap facility was allegedly seen by the CIA as compromising the integrity of intelligence operations pertaining to the satellite projects Rayolite and Argus, used for monitoring and surveillance of missile launch sites in the Soviet Union and China, which were unknown to the Australian government at the time, despite a blanket sharing agreement between the two countries. Pine Gap was the node through which signals intelligence from across Southeast Asia and the broader Pacific was processed. When Whitlam threatened to close Pine Gap, he was threatening to shut down a key component of the American intelligence architecture that processed signals from Vietnam, from Laos, from Cambodia, from China. The CIA couldn't allow this, and the Australian intelligence officers embedded in operations that connected back to Pine Gap were part of the reason the CIA felt it could pressure the Australian government through intelligence channels rather than diplomatic ones. Leaked Australian Defence Department documents disclosed that in 1972, high-frequency transmitters at Northwest Cape had helped the United States to mine Haiphong and other North Vietnamese harbors, and that satellites controlled from Pine Gap and Nurungar were being used to pinpoint targets for the American bombing of Cambodia. Both these actions were undertaken by the United States without the consent or knowledge of the Australian government. Australian soil, Australian facilities, Australian intelligence infrastructure had been used to conduct American military operations that the Australian government had not authorized, and Australian intelligence officers who worked within the joint apparatus knew this was happening. They were inside the architecture that made it possible, which is why, when the CIA characterized Australian political leaders as security risks and collaborators, the operational subtext was unmistakable. Australian intelligence officers who knew too much about joint operations could not be allowed to come under the control of a government that might order them to disclose what they knew. Whitlam instantly dismissed US's Director General Bill Robertson in 1975 after discovering ASIS, along with the CIA, had assisted the Timorese Democratic Union in an attempted coup against the Portuguese administration in Timor-Leste, without informing Whitlam's government. Again, the same pattern. Australian intelligence officers operating inside CIA-directed operations, in this case in East Timor, without the knowledge or authorization of the elected Australian government. Robertson hadn't gone rogue in any personal sense. He was functioning within the institutional logic of an intelligence service that had been built to serve the CIA alliance first and the Australian government second. The relationship had been structured that way for so long that the officers inside it had internalized its priorities. When Robertson was fired, the CIA didn't see it as a legitimate act of governmental oversight. They saw it as another escalation in Whitlam's assault on the intelligence relationship. The Nixon administration and the CIA saw shared intelligence as the crown jewels of the U.S.-Australia relationship and were now on the hunt to destroy Whitlam's government. That phrase, the crown jewels, is revealing. Intelligence sharing was not, from the CIA's perspective, a service the United States provided to Australia or a mutual benefit of a genuine partnership. It was a lever, a source of dependency and control. Australia was valuable to the CIA, not just because of what Australia could contribute to joint operations, but because what Australia contributed had given Canberra access to information the CIA could not allow to become public. The more deeply Australia's intelligence officers were embedded in the classified zones of American operations, the more leverage the CIA had over the Australian government. If Whitlam disclosed CIA operations in Australia, the CIA could respond by cutting intelligence access, which Australian national security planners had been told was essential. If Whitlam named CIA officers operating in Australia, the CIA could respond with its own naming of Australian officers operating in ways the Australian public wouldn't be comfortable with. The escalation reached its formal conclusion in November 1975. The ASIO liaison with the CIA's East Asia desk received a telex from the CIA desk chief, Ted Shackley. It stated that if CIA agents were named in Parliament, intelligence sharing with Australia would cease. The telex circulated in Canberra before being supplied to Kerr. The structural choice here matters enormously. Shackley's telex went to ASIO's liaison officer, not to the Australian government. It went through the intelligence channel, bypassing the diplomatic channel, bypassing the elected prime minister, bypassing every mechanism through which a legitimate allied government communicates its concerns to another legitimate allied government. Shackley described his threat as an official démarche on a service-to-service link, which meant that it was to bypass the government, and that ASIO was to continue to lie to Whitlam about the bases and to pressure the government into accepting CIA demands. A service-to-service link. The CIA was communicating directly with the Australian intelligence apparatus, directing it to act against its own elected government. The Australian officers who had been embedded in the classified zones of the CIA's Vietnam operations were now part of the machinery being used to terminate the government that had tried to find out what those operations were. On November 10, 1975, Whitlam was shown a top-secret telex message sourced to Theodore Shackley, the notorious head of the CIA's East Asia Division. Shackley's message was read to Whitlam. It said that the Prime Minister of Australia was a security risk in his own country, an intelligence report about a sitting Prime Minister, not an assessment of foreign threats to Australia, not a warning about enemy infiltration of Australian institutions, a report by a foreign intelligence service characterizing an elected head of government as a security risk in his own country. This is the document that the title of this story references, not a report naming a specific Australian intelligence officer in a specific classified zone. Something broader and more dangerous than that. A CIA assessment that the leader of a sovereign allied nation needed to be removed. The mechanism through which this assessment achieved its effect was Governor-General Sir John Kerr, who held the ceremonial position of the Crown's representative in Australia, and who, on November 11, 1975, used powers that most constitutional lawyers considered dormant to dismiss the Whitlam government and install the opposition as a caretaker administration. The CIA often referred to Kerr as "our man," according to former Pine Gap decoder Christopher Boyce, speaking to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1982. Whether Kerr acted at CIA direction, under CIA influence, or independently, in response to a crisis partly manufactured by CIA pressure, the outcome was the same. The Prime Minister, who had demanded to know what his intelligence services were doing in Vietnam, in Chile, in East Timor, who had ordered his intelligence chief to sever CIA ties and watch the order be ignored, who had been characterized by CIA officers in Saigon as equivalent to an enemy collaborator, was removed from office the day after the Shackley démarche circulated through Canberra. Victor Marchetti, a CIA officer turned critic of the U.S. intelligence community who had helped set up the Pine Gap facility, said that the threatened closure of U.S. bases in Australia caused apoplexy in the White House, and a kind of chili was set in motion. Marchetti's words connect the Whitlam episode directly to the template of regime change the CIA had used elsewhere. The same tools, the same logic, the same institutional willingness to act against the elected government of an allied nation. What made Australia's case different from Chile was not the CIA's intent, but the mechanism. In Chile, there was a military coup, soldiers in the streets, a presidential palace under assault. In Australia, there was a constitutional mechanism, a governor-general exercising rarely used powers, a transfer of power that looked legal from the outside even as its causes were anything but. The Australian intelligence officers who had operated in the classified zones of the Vietnam War were not the primary targets of this story. They were, in a sense, its backdrop. They were the evidence of how deeply the CIA had penetrated Australian national security institutions, how completely the intelligence relationship had compromised Australia's sovereignty, how thoroughly the officers who were supposed to serve Australia's interests had been converted into instruments of a foreign intelligence service's operational agenda. When Whitlam tried to find out who those officers were and what they had been doing, the CIA responded not by providing answers, but by removing the questioner. The report that mattered was not a dossier on a specific Australian officer. It was the assessment that the entire governmental structure through which those officers were accountable had become a security risk and needed to be removed. Their reports were not objective. They could not tell their ministers that the war was unwinnable and that Australia should withdraw before more of its task force in the Phuoc Tuy province were killed. This observation about the inability of Australian intelligence services to provide their government with honest assessments that contradicted American objectives captures the essential dysfunction of the relationship. An intelligence service that cannot tell its elected government the truth is not a national intelligence service. It is an instrument of whatever foreign power has shaped its institutional culture, its operational dependencies, its assessment framework. Australia's intelligence services in Vietnam had become so integrated into the American intelligence architecture that they had lost the capacity for independent national assessment. They were reporting what the alliance required, not what Australian national interests demanded. One senior Australian official noted that intelligence agencies are prone to believe that they are better informed and more patriotic, even than prime ministers. They handle a lot of material, but in my experience have poor judgment. There is little effective oversight and accountability. This observation cuts to the heart of what made the classified zones of the Vietnam intelligence war so dangerous for Australian sovereignty. The people inside those zones genuinely believed they were serving Australian interests. They had internalized the CIA's priorities so completely that they experienced those priorities as their own. When Whitlam told them to stop working with the CIA, they didn't experience this as a legitimate governmental instruction. They experienced it as interference with the work that actually mattered, the serious work of intelligence professionals as distinct from the uninformed interventions of politicians. This wasn't cynical betrayal. It was something more insidious: the complete capture of an institution's professional identity by a foreign power's operational culture. When America, Australia, and New Zealand fought in the Vietnam War, they jointly shared intelligence on the activities of the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. This included hunting down enemy arms caches and tracking Soviet and Chinese assistance to North Vietnam. The joint intelligence sharing was real. The operational benefit was real. But the Iowa price Australia paid for that benefit: the compromise of its institutional independence, the conversion of its intelligence services into CIA proxy operations, the creation of a situation in which a foreign intelligence service could effectively direct the removal of an elected government, was a price no one in Canberra had ever agreed to pay. It was the cost that accumulated silently over decades of classified operations in Vietnam and elsewhere, in the zones where Australia's contribution to the joint war effort was being leveraged by the CIA into something far beyond intelligence partnership. Whitlam later established a Royal Commission into Intelligence and Security. The Hope Royal Commission, named for Justice Robert Hope, who led it, was the mechanism through which Australia finally brought its intelligence services under democratic oversight. 3 royal commissions have examined, among other things, ISIS and its operations in 1974 and 1983 with the Hope Royal Commissions, and in 1994. On 21 August 1974, the Whitlam government appointed Justice Robert Hope to conduct a royal commission into the structure of Australian security and intelligence services, the nature and scope of the intelligence required, and the machinery for ministerial control, direction, and coordination of the security services. In 1977, the Hope Commission revealed the existence of the Australian Secret Intelligence Service and the Defence Signals Directorate. Australia's spy agency, which had been operating since 1952, was publicly acknowledged to exist for the first time in 1977. The officers who had spent years in Vietnam's classified intelligence zones, working in operations the Australian public didn't know existed, had finally been brought into the light of democratic accountability, not because the CIA allowed it, because an elected prime minister had been willing to fight for it, had paid the ultimate political price for fighting for it, and had set in motion a process that eventually, partially, reluctantly, produced the oversight structures Australia needed. The story of what the CIA produced about Australian intelligence officers operating in Vietnam's most classified zones is not ultimately a story about a single document or a single officer. It is a story about what happens when a small nation's intelligence services become so deeply integrated into a larger nation's intelligence architecture that the distinction between partner and proxy disappears. The classified zone in which Australian officers operated was everywhere and nowhere. Every operation they participated in, every agent they met, every piece of intelligence they handled was simultaneously an Australian national intelligence contribution and a CIA asset in a relationship the CIA controlled and the Australian government could not examine. When the Australian government tried to examine it, the CIA produced the assessment that it couldn't be allowed to, and acted on that assessment through channels that bypassed every democratic safeguard Australia had. What had an important impact on Hope was the superb work done by the analytical side of CIA. This visit was crucially important in shaping Hope's view that Australia needed a central intelligence agency, but needed one that would be very different to the CIA. One focused on intelligence assessment and coordination of the community while leaving collection and covert operations to a separate organization. Hope's insight, drawn from examining what the CIA had actually done in Australia and to Australia, was that the problem wasn't intelligence sharing. It was the structural subordination of the smaller partner in an intelligence alliance. Australia needed the capability but not the dependence. It needed the product but not the proxy relationship. It needed intelligence officers who understood their first loyalty was to the government that employed them, not to the foreign partners whose operations employed them. The Australian intelligence officers who had operated in Vietnam's classified zones deserve recognition for the genuine contributions they made to a war that Australia had committed to fighting. They were professional, skilled, and often courageous in environments that put them at real personal risk. But the system they operated in was designed not to serve Australian interests, but to maximize CIA operational reach, using Australian cover, Australian relationships, and Australian officers as instruments of American intelligence objectives that were never fully disclosed to the governments those officers theoretically served. That was the real classified zone of the Vietnam Intelligence War, not a location on a map, not a specific operation or a specific officer. The zone was the relationship itself and what it had done to Australian sovereignty over the course of 2 decades of secret war. The telex from Shackley, the characterization by Snepp, the ignoring of Whitlam's orders by Barber, the dismissal of Robertson, the firing of Whitlam himself, these were not isolated events. They were the visible symptoms of a structural problem that had been building since 1952, when Australia created an intelligence service that was, from its first operational days, more oriented toward CIA objectives than toward the democratic accountability it nominally served. The most classified zone in which Australia's intelligence officers operated in Vietnam was the zone of institutional loyalty, where the question of who those officers actually served had been answered over years of operational integration in a way that prioritized the CIA over Canberra. When that answer finally collided with a government determined to ask the question properly, the collision was not just operational, it was constitutional, and the reverberations, the oversight structures, the legislative frameworks, the democratic accountability mechanisms that now govern Australian intelligence, all of it flows from the moment when the CIA decided that an Australian Prime Minister asking questions about what his country's intelligence officers had been doing in Vietnam's most classified zones was a security risk who needed to be removed. They put it in writing. They sent it through channels that bypassed the government. And for a moment, they succeeded. The answer to what they produced about that Australian must be removed came not in a classified cable but in a democratic reckoning that outlasted every officer and every operation it touched.